So in the previous lesson, what we did was spend some time talking about the First World War and the reasons for, firstly, the US neutrality in the First World War, and then secondly, the reasons for them entering, ultimately, the First World War in 1917. This lesson is going to talk about the impact of the First World War on the United States. So, like I said, the previous lesson talked about the entry of the United States into the First World War, and we spent some time taking a general introduction to the subject of the First World War. There's not that much that you should be worried about knowing for this particular module. Obviously, you're going to be tested on US interest in the First World War, and you're going to be tested on the reasons for the US entering the First World War and the impact that it had. You're not necessarily going to be tested on the minutiae of details of the First World War itself. This isn't a subject in military history. This is just ordinary history. But we did a basic introduction to what essentially happened in the First World War, and then we spent some time looking at the US government. This is what we'll do in this lesson. We'll spend some time looking at the US government and societal conditions during the war itself and the impact that the First World War had on the United States. And let's just begin by talking about the greatest impact of the First World War on the United States, which is, of course, the economic impact. The economic impact was that of quite a significant cost. So first of all, the First World War itself cost around $30 billion for the United States in money back then. So try and calculate that for inflation today, and you can see that it's a significant amount of money. Now, this $30 billion was funded through two systems. It was funded firstly through a loan system. This was where citizens were invited to essentially invest in the war effort itself by raising revenue for fighting. These included two specific loans, one being called the Liberty Loan, the second being called the Victory Loan. And essentially the overall cost of these two loans contributed to around $20 billion. So a quite significant amount of the overall cost was paid for by this loan system, the invitation on citizens to invest in the war effort. The final $10 billion was raised through the increase of taxation. The increase of raising of income tax contributed to the raising of over $10 billion. So they were able to pay for the war in quite uncontroversial ways. So obviously, if they paid for the war entirely using taxation increases, that might have caused some economic and social problems at home with people not wanting to pay so much taxation. But they managed to get most of the war effort costs through voluntary investments, through the Liberty Loan and the Victory Loan. So while there was a social impact of the First World War. Of course, there would be a social impact of the First World War. This social impact was limited mainly to that of African Americans and to a lesser extent that of women. So during World War II, for example, women would play an incredibly important role in the war effort among the Allied powers, just like women play an incredibly important role across the entire world for the war effort during the Second World War. But by contrast, in World War One, women in the US didn't mobilize en masse to contribute to this war effort. This is partially owing to the fact that many labor unions were in fact still opposed to the idea of recruiting women in industry. But as the war continued, we also see a mass movement of African Americans in northern states to seek out work. This actually became known as the mass migration, or the Great Migration, where African American workers entered into the urban cities in places like New York and Detroit, and the reason for this was to contribute to the war effort. Now, because the United States was a very fresh, new power entering the First World War quite late on, it essentially meant that the impact of the First World War wasn't as heavy on the United States as it was on, say, France, Great Britain, and Germany. In fact, compared to those countries, the US barely felt the First World War in comparison. This is not to suggest that they didn't feel the First World War. Of course, a global war is always going to be costly and expensive, but compared to those countries, the US fared quite well, considerably speaking. Again, partially because they entered the war very late, they were very fresh in entering the war, and also because they entered the war right towards the end of the First World War itself. If we compare this to the Second World War, where they entered in 1941, there was still a considerable amount of fighting left to be done on two fronts in the Second World War, and so the US really had to mobilize a lot more than they did in the First World War. Another aspect or element of the US society during the First World War was the impact of government control. So the federal executive had gained from Congress extensive powers of control of the war effort as late as 1917-1918, the executive, of course, being represented by the presidency. The most pertinent of this included the curtailing of civil liberties, such as the First Amendment right to freedom of expression. This was done with the 1917 Espionage Act, which made it illegal to send materials that were deemed seditious through the mail. And then in addition to this, we see the expansion of the Espionage Act in 1918 with the passing of the Sedition Act. Again, this expanded previous legislation and made it illegal to speak of or even express opinions of the government war effort in a negative light. Now, what's really interesting is that these new pieces of legislation brought with it new cases to the US Supreme Court on the question of the First Amendment. Now, for anybody who studies US politics, or maybe if in the future you study the US Constitution, like US constitutional law, you will come to the conclusion that when you study the First Amendment, you will find that the First Amendment doesn't really get much of a look in for the majority of US history. It is only during the First World War and during this quite late on period in US history that we see an explosion of cases discussing the First Amendment and discussing the right to freedom of expression. And this is really where a lot of our history of the First Amendment begins. Because, of course, you have things like the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. You then have legislation that is passed in the 1930s and 1940s in relation to the Second World War. And then you get an explosion in the kind of curtailing and cutting down of freedom of expression during the Cold War with things like McCarthyism, for example. All of which, of course, feeds into more and more cases on the question of the First Amendment, which is, of course, the right to freedom of expression and religion and other such expressions.